Okay, your workbook. It's going to be performable, not so much on theory, so there's going to be a strong how-to focus. So within this, you'll have assessments, checklists, flowcharts, decision tables, and worksheets, and you'll be able to download blank copies of all these different job aids from your workbook from our Learning Center website. And in fact, on Thursday afternoon, you'll get an email from Erica, and it should contain a link right to where you can download all these tools. So mark up your book, highlight it, make it your own. A couple things around how the workshop operates. Just as kind of a quick graph association, anytime you see a white background slide, you know that there's content related specifically to the book. Anytime you see a dark slide with a blue light bulb, it means that we're going to ask you to do something. Now, this workshop might be different than ones that you've attended in the past because you're actually going to be working while you're here. In fact, you'll see about 49 of these dark colored slides, which means that there's going to be a lot of practice, a lot of activity. Because frankly, if you don't practice it here, you're not going to put it to work when you're back at work. So you'll see like there's even time limits for these as well. Now, we'll give you adequate time. We've run this workshop. We're comfortable with the speed and the pace, but this kind of gives you an idea of what you'll see up on the screen. But we did not build the workshop around the slide deck, we built it around your workbook, okay? So that's the most important part of reference. Okay, most important pages in your toolkit are on page 130 and 131. Would you please flip over there? These 3 days will represent some significant inputs we're making into your development, but we're not here for inputs, we're here for outputs. And you'll begin to define some of those outputs over on page 130 and 131, and at the end of almost all the tab sections, I'm going to have you go back to these pages and begin to reflect. And you're going to ask, how am I going to take the skills and the processes and the tools I've gained here and put them to work back at work? Now, I think we're all familiar with the concept of action plans, but truth be told, they usually run into them last 5 minutes of the course. Okay, write down 3 New Year's resolutions, and we know what happens to those. So we're not going to approach these as New Year's resolutions, but actually specific things that we plan to put into work then over the next 12 weeks following the workshop. So make use of these pages, please. I'd like to spend a couple minutes giving a context for why we're here and what we're going to learn and how we're going to benefit. So let's first talk about why we're here. We're here to learn and to acquire and to practice and to refine and apply some really essential management leadership skills. One of the things I find interesting about Emerson is we're a promote from within company. And between 80 to 85% of our leadership across the globe, across our businesses, comes from within the organization. That's really exceptional. I've not seen other companies like that. So if we're promote from within and 85% of our leadership comes from within the organization, what does it tell you about our company? They believe in their people. What does it tell you about you? They value you. What does it tell you about the strategic purpose of this workshop? So this is going to be a really important investment. Now, probably for many of us in this room, before we took on a role where maybe we were responsible for the performance of others, we maybe had a title where we were referred to as an individual contributor. And you're probably a sustained high performer and you did really, really good work. So what normally happens is what? Somebody notices that and then you get promoted, right? But we also know that whatever skills made us great individual contributors are not the skills that we need to successfully manage and lead others, right? We need to kind of quit our old job because now we're responsible for the performance of other people, so that requires different skill sets. And in order to do that, we need some really good training on how to manage and how to lead. Now, beyond all this as well, what we're trying to do from a global perspective in One Emerson is create a common way for how we manage and lead others, because as employees go from manager to manager over their career, they're really expecting some consistency and continuity from their leadership. And what we found is almost every manager and leader has a different way of doing things. And that could provide some frustration, if not outright disengagement. So again, one of the reasons we're here is to create what I'll call a common practice based on a best practice. And there'll be a lot of practice here as we do that along the way. So that's why we're here. So what good is that? Go to page 1, and there's 4 benefits that we've identified. They're also on this flip chart over here up against the wall. I'll give you an idea of where these 4 business outcomes came from. When we were revising leading at Emerson and moving from kind of a heavy theory-based course to a more practical how-to, I went to 3 top executives over in the LAE building, and as we got the project underway, I asked a simple question. I said, gentlemen, complete the sentence for me. Leading at Emerson 2.0 will be a success when? And you know what they said? That's a really good question. Let's take some time and think about it. About 30 minutes later, our top leaders in the company came back with 4 things to fill in that sentence. Leading at Emerson will be a success when we see these 4 things. Now, I imagine these aren't the first time you saw these. These were part of your personal workshop planner. Hopefully you were able to discuss a couple of these things with your manager as part of your pre-workshop briefing. So let me ask you, you've seen this before. If you personally were to attain 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these outcomes as a result of these 3 days invested, will our time together be worth it? Absolutely. So this, I'll call this our true north, or this is actually the mission statement of this workshop. Everything that we're going to do is focused on these business outcomes. This is the end. Everything else over the 3 days is going to be a means to that end. I've been at Emerson about 4.5 years now, and no matter where in the world I've gone, I've noticed that we tend to use the phrases managing a team and leading a team almost interchangeably, but they're really not. So as a way of now talking about what we're going to learn over the next couple days and how that's going to translate into these outcomes, I'd like you to do some thinking. First, I'd like you to bring to mind somebody you know from your past experience who's a great manager. They just are really able to get the work done through others. So I want you to think, what are the things that she or he does or did that made them a great people manager in the workplace? I'd also like you to bring to mind somebody you know from your past experience who is a great leader in the workplace. They may or may not have had direct reports, but somehow they were able to lead and inspire people. What are the things that they did that made them such a great leader? What I'm going to ask you to do is, in your groups and on your flip charts, I'd like you to create 2 lists for me. It should be formatted like you see here up on the screen. On one column, all the characteristics of great managers in the workplace. The other column, all the characteristics of a great leader. And then we'll compare and contrast this list, and then coming up with these answers will help us provide, I think, the exact context for why we're here, what we're going to learn, how we're going to benefit. Would you take 10 minutes as a group and go ahead and put that on your flip chart? Could I have somebody from each group give us 3 characteristics of a great manager, and then we'll go around the room and each group try to give us something additive. So if something's been said, go ahead and check that off and report on something different. So will you start with 3 characteristics of a manager? All those things are true. There's a couple other things I see too. They provide regular feedback. They set expectations. I see that in a lot of here. So when you look at the role of a manager, it's necessarily short-term in focus. You're focusing on the specific work that you have in front of you or over the next year. And you're thinking about how you're putting together human and financial and material resources into some kind of productive working system. That's what managers do. How are leaders different? Let's start here with the leader and go around the room. While they're reporting back, I encourage you, write these down on page 7 for yourself. You know, the palest ink is better than the sharpest mind, so go ahead and write these down as we go around. Give us 3 characteristics of a great leader. Okay, so they inspire, and a lot of times the way that they inspire is by having that vision. It's easy to compare this list, but let's take a minute and contrast it. What I'd like you to do is just take 1 minute with your team and say, what are some of the bigger differences here? We can see pretty clearly what's similar here, because some of them have bled over to both sides, but what would you say are some of the differences or the bigger differences? Take a minute and discuss that, and then you'll come back to me. We tend to use these words interchangeably at Emerson, but we can't. So one of the reasons why sometimes people come to the workshop is they want to know, okay, what's Emerson's take on this? So let's actually look at some Emerson definitions now. They're over on the next page of management and leadership. So one's short-term, one's kind of long-term. One's focused, one's a little bit broader. But management is how we go about, again, marshaling human and financial material resources to get it done through others. But leadership's different. It's the process by which we influence others to gain their commitment. And again, like Lori and her group over here said, the way we do this is by creating a vision that inspires people. But I think two questions that are really worth asking here are at the bottom of this page. Now we've kind of identified characteristics of great managers and leaders, and we've seen some definitions. I think a question to consider is, what's likely to happen if all we do is manage our employees, but we're not leading them? And what's likely to happen if all we're doing is leading, but we're not managing? Could you take a minute and discuss that with your table, maybe 2 or 3 minutes? We have to earn it. And frankly, the title leader really doesn't exist at Emerson. Anyone can lead. So let's answer these questions now. What happens if all we're going to do is manage? Let's taking a look at those characteristics as great managers. What's likely to happen if all we're doing is that, but we're not leading? What's the best we'll probably get from employees? Here's the phrase, and we'll say it repetitively. If all we do is manage and not lead, probably the best we'll get from our employees is their compliance. Yeah, they'll do what they have to do because they have to. However, if we manage and lead our employees, it's not now about compliance. It's like what you said, Tom. We're getting their commitment. We get that discretionary effort. What do you see as the difference between an employee who's compliant and an employee who's committed? Let's be very clear here. In terms of a manager and leader, you are both. In case you had any questions, at Emerson, we expect you to be a manager and a leader. And we need to do both of these. We're using different but complementary skill sets. But let's look at the second question. What's likely to happen if all we're doing is leading but we're not managing? Like we're full of inspiration and setting visions and being a great example, but we're not managing. Have you heard the expression, vision without execution is hallucination? So we need to have a good balance. So that sets the context for what we're going to learn here, because as we look at getting these 4 outcomes, some of these 4 outcomes you see on the flip chart are management skills. Some of them are leadership skills. It's really like 2 sides of a coin. And when you think of 2 sides of a coin, is one side of a coin more valuable than the other? No. But both sides combined create what? A coin, or a certain amount of value. Yeah. And so it is with managing and leading. So we'll be looking at both sides of the coin while we're here. So that's good. But I would suggest that you are not here for a workshop. You're actually here to learn an operating system. You're here to learn an operating system for how we manage and lead to get their commitment and move away from just compliance. To be able to do both of these well requires skill. And that's why we're here. And it not only requires a skill, but then the will to put it to work back at work too. We have priorities, and we have a lot, and we have to decide what goes to the front of the queue, what goes to the back of the queue, what do we say yes to? And as we move on to the organization, our types of priorities as we manage and lead begin to change. So like, for example, in a frontline supervisor role, we might spend more time doing, we spend time interacting, we have some time thinking. In fact, at the bottom of page 9, let's come up with a list of things that we do. Using an action, verb, and a noun, what are some examples of doing activities that you and I perform? So we've got thinking activities, we've got doing activities, we've got interacting activities. And with all the things that we have going on, we have shifting priorities. Sometimes they compete, sometimes they complement. We have to identify where we're going to put our time and energies and resources, given our bandwidth. But this is an interesting graphic. And we have it on a flip chart because we'll refer to it quite a bit over the next couple days. You'll notice something happens as you make the career progression from a frontline supervisor to senior management. What happens? The amount of time you spend doing decreases as you move up different organizational levels. Which one of these ratios never changes regardless of what level you're at? The amount of time you spend interacting with others never changes. Why? Why is that? Regardless of what level you are in the organization, this ratio never changes. How come? So it's about relationships, right? And again, maybe like 2 sides of a coin, relationships and results. And both of them are equally important at Emerson. So one of the outputs that we see from this workshop is if you apply the process and use the tools, we can guarantee you that you'll find that you'll spend less time doing, and you get to spend more time on those higher value activities of thinking and interacting. How many of you would love to have more time to think? Yeah, I can guarantee you from what I've heard from now facilitating 42 of these capstone conference calls, one of the things that you will gain from this workshop is what I call margin. Now, when you hear the word margin, you think of space, right? When I use the word margin in a leadership workshop, I'm talking about the space between my load and my limit. And truth be told, many of us are operating with very little margin. There's not a lot of space between the load and the limit, so I'll guarantee you, if you apply the skills you'll gain here, you will get that space that you need to interact and to think. Now, this can be a challenge for anybody, but this could be especially a challenge for the person who's just made the role from an individual contributor to frontline supervisor. What's different for them? And why could this be such a challenge for them?
We're leading peers now.
Yeah, so they might be leading some peers, so there's some relationship re-engineering that has to take place. What else is new or different? In their old world, they had to focus on what? Just themselves. Now, what is it about? It's about getting the work done through others. And what I find is this is really tough to make this move from individual contributor to frontline supervisor, because we often think, well, whatever made me a great individual contributor, I'll just do that plus some steroids and I'll be a great supervisor, right? But whatever made us a great individual contributor is not the skills that we need to successfully manage and lead others, to manage and lead and inspire and gain their commitment. It's a different type of skill set. So that said, what I'd like you to do now is individually, I'd like you to bring to mind the best boss you've ever had. And I'd like you to answer these 4 questions on page 10 in your workbook. I've given you a few minutes per question, but take some time. Be as behaviorally specific as you can when you answer these questions. What were some of the, let's take a look at questions 1 and 2. What are some things that you wrote down? You don't have to tell me who you wrote it down about, but what were some of the things that jumped out to you for questions 1 or 2? Yeah, so some of the same elements that were at play with Jake, the whole idea of trust and empowerment and responsibility. Somebody recently called that out in a recent workshop. She said that, I think about the best boss I ever had, it was not anything she ever said. It's just that I know I was being heard. Not necessarily that I was being agreed with, but I know that my boss listened to me. Good. Let's take a look at question number 3. For those of you who have direct reports, how would they benefit if you were the best boss they ever had? Let's imagine this scenario. For those of you who have direct reports, let's imagine 1 year from now, they're in this Leading at Emerson workshop, and we're on page 10. And I said, what I'd like you to do is bring to mind the best boss you ever had. And instantly, your face comes right in front of them, and they think of you. Would that be cool? I think that would be something that we could aspire to. So how would they benefit if you were the best boss they ever had? You're exactly right. I'm glad you pointed that out. In other words, we're going to spend less time supervising. And I think a lot of us would like that, because what we're doing is creating self-directing employees. Self-directed employees, when they're performing well, they know they're performing well and why, and they figure out how to take it to a new level. But I've also discovered, and I think you have too, that self-directed employees, when they're missing the mark, they kind of self-diagnose and can self-correct as well, which is great. All of our employees are at different levels of self-direction yet. So here's my question. When you think about the best boss you've ever had, have you told her this yet? Or have you told him that? If you haven't, I'd like you to try to do that. And you'll be amazed at the impact. I did this a few years ago. It wasn't as detailed as this, but somebody said, I want you to think about the best boss you ever had and what made she or he the best boss you ever had. And I instantly, a guy named Tom Woodall came to my mind, and I began to actually write down. At that point, I tuned out whatever the facilitator was saying. I began to write down what made Tom the best boss I ever had. And I thought, I should probably ring him and let him know. Now, he had been long retired, but I gave him a call. I had stayed in touch with him through emails, but not very frequently. And I gave him a call, said, Tom, this is Terrence, and you remember me from the late 1970s. I said, I just went through some activity where I had to think about the best boss I ever had, and over my career, and it was you. And could I take a couple minutes and tell you why? And he begins to laugh. He goes, I'm 75, I'm retired. I'm not going anywhere. Fire away. So I wanted to be respectful of his time, so I took about 3 minutes. I just went through a fairly detailed list about you're the best boss because I saw how you managed, and I also saw how you led to gain my commitment and how you had the vision and you helped us get there. So after about 3 minutes, I summed it up and said, so Tom, in summary, this is why I think you're the best boss I've ever had, and I wanted to say thank you. And the other end of the phone was just completely dead, no sound. So I thought, Tom? No answer. Tom? No answer. And I began to say something like, oh crud, this stupid cell phone dropped. And as I was saying that, kind of muttering to myself, he said, no, I'm here. He said, but I'm 75, but for the first time in my life, I'm at a complete loss for words. He said, I really do not know what to say. I said, I wasn't expecting you to say anything. I just wanted to tell you and thank you. He said, no, Terrence, there's more to it than you realize. He says, I'm 75, and I'm looking in the rearview mirror of my life. And I look back on quiet days asking is if what I did over my life made any difference. He said, Terrence, you'll never know what this call does for me. So I don't know about you, but how many of you would like to get a phone call like that? I think it's something that we could all aspire to, and I can commit to you, again, if you're diligent about putting this to work back at work, it's more likely than not that that's going to happen. So it's interesting how people apply this. When we rolled this out in India, the corporate director of HR was in the workshop at the 90-minute break, which starts in about 4 minutes. She actually decided she was going to text her boss and say, you're the best boss I've ever had, and here's why. And about 10 minutes later, she gets a text back from the boss that just simply said, WTF? Followed by another text saying, isn't it a little bit early to start drinking? So at the next break after that, she actually called him up and said, I went through this activity. I had to think about the best boss I've ever had, and you manage me well, you lead me well, I'm inspired, and I just wanted to call that out, so thanks very much. So maybe that's something for all of us to aspire to. We'll go back to page 10 a few times. In fact, why don't you grab a tape flag right now, a Post-it note pad, and flag that page. Anyone who works produces something, right? So my question to you is, what is your product? In your role as a manager and or a leader, what do you produce? I'd like you to turn to a neighbor, just one person next to you, and let's see what you can come up with. We'll have one group of 3 here. The rest of you just pair off. I'm not asking you what you do, I'm asking what you produce. One's the end, one's the means to an end. If you've never thought about it before, I'd like to suggest to you that when you manage and lead others, your real product is their performance. That's really what we produce. So to kind of set a stage and kind of a overall layer of what we're looking at here over the next couple days, here's what I think is one of the most important questions we'll ever ask ourselves. It's right here up on the slide. There's a place for you to write it down on page 11. This will be on the test tonight. But here it is. What must I do to create the kind of performance I need from others to get the business outcomes we want? And when I ask this question as a manager and leader, what must I do to create the kind of performance I need in others to get the business outcomes we want? You've probably all heard that expression, great leaders always begin with the end in mind. So here's actually how I'd like us to approach this question. What are the outcomes that I want? What kind of performance do I need from others for us to get these outcomes? And then what do I do to create that kind of performance? Again, maybe like Tom said, moving from compliance to commitment to get these outcomes. So this is a question I ask myself all the time, and we want you to ask yourself. I ask this time of year when it's goal setting season, right? We're beginning to create goals for the fiscal year 2018. I ask this question when I'm giving employees feedback. Feedback that maintains or feedback that modifies. I'm thinking about this in coaching sessions. I think about this when I'm delegating work as a way of developing employees. And when I began to ask this question, my view of my role changed, and my view of the people I support changed as well. If we could actually change our job titles from supervisor or leader, I'd say we're really performance makers. That's really what we're producing, is the performance of others. And when you look at those flip charts again, it's those two sides of the coin, that how we manage and how we lead helps create that performance that helps us get those outcomes. The worst thing I could ever hear from anybody who takes this workshop is actually, oh, this was really informational. Leading at Emerson was not designed to be informational. It was really designed to be transformational. And somehow I hope too that as you go through the process and the tools of this Leading at Emerson operating system, you'll never look at your job quite the same way again. So let's set this into a higher context now, called the leadership chain, on page 13. I see this more and more as part of our corporate presentations. For those of you who know Steve Pelch, who's the Executive Vice President of Organizational Planning, and all of corporate human resources reports into him. This is in every one of Steve's presentation. Our goal at Emerson is to be a healthy, high-performing organization. We want to have outstanding organizational performance. It's like that question we just looked at. The way that we do this is by creating and fostering and building and maintaining a positive work environment. That's created by the types of leadership behaviors that you and I demonstrate. The underpinnings of these behaviors are our commitment to live and operate under our values, and also the competencies or the skills that we develop and demonstrate that affect our behaviors, that affect the environment, that affect the organizational climate and organizational performance. So, why we're here is primarily to learn and acquire these, which give us this, which give us this. That's why we're calling it a leadership chain. So let's first talk about the values. Let's go to the next page. You may be among some of the first groups to see this. As you know, if you're in St. Louis, you've probably seen these now in banners. You've seen them in the Learning Center. You might have them in your lobby as well. You certainly see them on the light posts as you come in and out of campus. But these are our values. These are 7 things that make Emerson Emerson. So these are values that make us what we are. If you've not seen these before, I'd like you to take a minute and read through them. Because I think what's helpful about this page is it not only tells you the values and the definitions, but it also helps you identify the types of behaviors that are displayed when you're living these values and the specific leadership competencies that you develop. So when I'm looking at pages 14 and 15, and then I'm also looking at your flip charts, I see a lot of correlations here. Yeah, there's a lot of correlations. So these are our values, and that guides our leadership behaviors, but the other underpinning are our specific leadership competencies. I have them for you on the next 2 pages as a frame of reference. When we looked at what we wanted to accomplish, and specifically the leadership competencies we wanted to develop across Emerson in this workshop, on page 16 and 17, 8 leadership competencies clearly came out. They're described here on these 2 pages, 16 and 17. And we have descriptions of somebody who is skilled in these competencies. These are the things that they're demonstrating, she or he demonstrate. Not all of these come naturally, but these can be developed, and they will be. And these are the types of things that we're developing in our 3 days together. I think a good way of making these 2 pages relevant is, after several of these tab sections, we'll go back to these pages and I'll ask you, if I followed the process and used the tools from my workbook, which ones of these competencies will I begin to be developing? I'll probably also ask you, if I use the tools in the process, which of these business outcomes will we be achieving as well? So 8 specific competencies that you could expect that we're going to be putting a good hit on over the 3 days together. So I've kind of given you the big picture of the end, what we're aiming for, but to accomplish that, we need a couple minutes and look at how we're going to get there. There's 10 specific objectives in this workshop. They were part of your personal workshop planner, but you'll see them on page 18. You saw these before, but now maybe we have a little bit more of a frame of reference. You might have talked these over with your manager before you came here as part of your pre-workshop briefing. So really, these 10 things are the means to those 4 outcomes. Now, anytime you look at a list of workshop objectives, you know that not all of them are equally weighted. I think some of them, because of their criticality, we need to spend more time on than others. Some we might need more time on to understand and practice and master and feel confident. At the same time, I would expect that some of these are more important to you than others. So I want to do a quick poll of the group. What I'm going to ask you to do is looking at page 18, I'd like you to highlight the 3 out of the 10 that are most important to you personally. Go ahead and just do that right now. Maybe read that list one more time on page 18. Put a check mark next to the 3 that you say, man, if I could only cover these 3, here they are. What I'd like you to do is grab a magic marker at your table, and over on this flip chart here, I'd like you to put your 3 check marks, transfer them over here. This will kind of give me a quick visual of where the group is at. Now we're going to cover all 10, but to what degree you're going to help me determine that. So within these as well, you all probably learn differently, right? Some of you learn best when you can interact with others and you're brainstorming on a flip chart. Some of you actually learn better when you're not interacting and you're just kind of in your notes yourself and reading. Some of you learn best in a case study where you can problem solve. Some of you learn best when you actually do it. So over our 2 and 6/8 days, we've got actually 49 different activities using 27 different instructional methods. So regardless of your learning style, there's really something here for you. So we'll cover all these and we'll check off our progress as we go along the way. So this is helpful for me. Does anyone happen to know when people go to like corporate training programs, how much of what you get in a training program actually gets used back at work? Give me a percentage. Think about all the training programs going on in corporate America or around the world. What we know is that in corporate training programs like at Emerson, at best what we typically do is see people use only about 14% of what they got, or 15% of what they got in a corporate training program, which means 86% of what they got in training goes unused. A good friend of mine coined a phrase that I think really captures this. He called it learning scrap. Yeah, so learning scrap is that 85 or 86% of whatever they got in training that never got put to work back at work. So there's a problem. Because sometimes companies talk about the cost of training, right? Especially when in times of economic constraint or restraint, we talk about the cost of training. One thing I've noticed and appreciated about Emerson, though, is we often talk about the cost of not training. I remember one time in a prior job when I was at SC Johnson, it was budget time, and there was a VP of sales trying to go after my training budget because he was hoping for a sales conference in Las Vegas, and he thought, well, I'll go after the training guy's money. So as we were negotiating and bargaining for budget, he goes, Terrence, you know, you need to understand, what if we train them and they leave? I go, John, what if we don't train them and they stay? I mean, if we think training is expensive, try incompetence. There's a cost for training and there's a cost for not training, and I think all of us in this room could come up with a cogent argument about the cost for not training. But the conversation that we're starting to have at Emerson is the cost of training that was given that's not being used, or the cost of learning scrap. So let's first explore what causes learning scrap. Why is it that we spend so much time and energies on training? If you're going to be here for 3 days and only use 14%, what causes learning scrap?
You don't put it into practice what you learn.
Yeah, you don't put it into practice. Right. So it could be that there's no reason to do it after the workshop. It could be that you don't have practice during the training, and truth be told, if you don't practice it during training, you're not going to do it after training. What else causes learning scrap? So do you come in treating this like another compliance course? Or are you going to come here because you're committed to it? There's a big difference. There's 3 types of people that come to training, right? You've heard them. You've got your prisoners, your vacationers, and your explorers. Who are your prisoners? The people who are told you need to take this workshop. Who are the vacationers?
3 days of no work.
3 days of no work. I can always tell when they come in from out of town because they, you know, when I'm at the door meeting them, they have a map of like the hill and they go, where are the best restaurants? You know? Where are the malls from here? You know, when you talk about a workshop, they're thinking about the shop part. And then you have the explorers. Who are they? Yeah, they want to take it and run it. So it could be different levels of motivation and buy-in and commitment or compliance. What else causes learning scrap? Yeah, I don't see how this fits. I don't see how it's relevant. This doesn't apply to me. How about a bad trainer? could be bad design, could be the wrong people in that. So learning scrap costs, but I would suggest that one of the reasons why learning scrap hits companies like us is we tend to approach programs like these as an event rather than a process. What's the difference between a training event and a training process? A training event is what? One time, 3 days, and then what? And then you're done. You've kind of checked the box. But a training process is what?
Ongoing.
It's ongoing. Yeah, it's spread out over time. So I want to introduce a very powerful concept. I walked your executive team through it when they were here for the one-day session. Let's take a look at page 19 in your book. Page 19 is called The New Finish Line for Learning. So we've extended the finish line for learning, and what we're doing is, as we look at now, treating this like an operating system as a series of phases. So you had the preparation phase. So as part of that, you had a pre-workshop briefing. You received a personal workshop planner. You probably saw a pre-workshop video greeting. How many of you, this was the first time you had ever gone to training and had a pre-workshop briefing with your boss? How many of you historically, when you went to training, you might have had no idea why you were there other than the fact that you were told to show up? So if that were the case, in the past, how many of you came to those workshops as prisoners and vacationers? You probably did, and rightly so. But what happened as a result of just having a few minutes with your manager before you came here? If she or he talked about, here's the purpose of the workshop, here's why you're going, here are the business outcomes, here are the learning objectives, here's what I'm expecting of you. What did that accomplish for you? It creates buy-in. I'll call it some kind of intentionality. And it's really interesting because there's no shortage of people that come up to me and saying, you know, I've been working at Emerson 20 years, and this is the first time I've ever come to training and been asked to have an expectation. Well, that's really sad. That's almost pathetic. I mean, for 20 years, you've come to training with no expectations? None at all. Well, what are you expecting now? I said, I'm expecting a lot. We're raising the bar. So a pre-workshop briefing, by the way, for those of you who have direct reports, when you send them to training, learning scrap hits your budget. I don't think you want that to happen. Here's now the instruction phase. Here's where we're at now, where we have 3 days of very focused, practice-intensive skill building. But at the end of 3 days, here's where we're leading, and in fact, it used to be 3.5 days. At the end of the workshop, what did instructors give out to the learners, to the employees, at the end of the course? A certificate. What message were they sending when they gave you a certificate at the end of the course? You're done. You've checked the box, and that's all that mattered. Were they done? No. So one of the reasons why I think we piled up learning scrap is because we kind of said, okay, you're done, here you go. Here's the idea going forward. I want you to write this down or remember it. The whole idea is now this: the real work begins when the workshop ends. Because these 3 days represent an input we're making in you, but then the next 12 weeks is what we talked about this morning, is the implementation or learning transfer phase. This is an input, these are outputs. We don't train you and invest in you for inputs, we do it for these outputs. So over the next 12 weeks, as you think about that implementation plan, back on pages 130 and 131 that I introduced this morning, you're going to put it to work. So as a way of beginning to think about this phase, I'd like you to flip over to page 132, because everything you write down in your implementation plan is not to be equated with the New Year's resolutions. You're going to begin to think about how you're going to do this. And in the middle of page 132, there's a kind of a summary of how you might want to begin to apply some of these skills. You know, for some of you, there's a really powerful concept called securing early wins. You know, for those of you who have direct reports, believe it or not, your direct reports already have higher expectations of you because they know that you're here. And they're expecting something from you. And so let's not let them down. So securing early wins is a great way of building momentum for you and for your team, and creates, I think somebody was saying this morning, that sense of traction. like there's something really good going on here. And securing early wins are not only good for you and your team, but also for your boss who authorized your coming to this training. It could be some low-hanging fruit. Some of the things that you'll implement might actually be low effort but high impact. Some of the things that you might decide to implement might actually be high effort and high impact. Sometimes, the best tasting fruit is not always the low-hanging fruit. So that's going to be up to you, but on page 132, kind of a summary of considerations, because on those 2 prior pages, if you'll go back, you're going to fill up those 2 pages fairly heavily over our 3 days together. But we want to make sure that when all is said and done, that it's actually getting done, right? Because usually it's more is said than done. So this is actually the most important part of the training, and that's what's significantly different about this training course than ones you've gone to before. So actually about Thursday afternoon, right after lunch, we'll actually move into this phase while we're here as a group, and we'll begin to plan our work and then work the plan, and then 12 weeks from now, we're going to be back together. If most of you are on campus, we'll probably be back in this room. And each one of you will take 3 or 4 minutes and briefly report back. Here's what I set out to accomplish. Here's what I did accomplish. And here's the impact it's had on my team and myself. Now, during our couple days together, I'll report back to you what I've been hearing now in having facilitated 42 of these meetings myself almost after 4 years, and give you some ideas of ways that your peers around the world are using these skills and the impact it's had on them and their team and on their business. And then that's the achievement phase, and we have what we call the new finish line for learning. So we've moved the finish line. What's your reaction to this compared to how you've done it in the past? Where we put the difference now is, again, like I said, what we put to work when we're back at work. So I want you to focus on that. That's the real success of our investment here, is what happens over the next 12 weeks.